Okay, thank you very much, Christina, for inviting me to be part of this wonderful roundtable. It's so great that all of us in different parts of the world can be here together in this virtual space. It's been a huge pleasure rereading these books and thinking about how we write history. So while preparing my remarks for this roundtable, I realized that in 2013, I'd given a paper at AAS about the sources that I used to reconstruct the life and times of Nakanui Nakako, the heroine of An Imperial Concubine's Tale, what I found and what I didn't. As those of you who've read my book may recall, in the end, I wasn't able to find anything by Nakako herself, something that I could translate and thus hear, something that would enable me to tell her side of the story in her own voice. I now think that I was too fixated on the notion of an authentic personal voice. I mean, is there really such a thing as an unmediated, authentic personal voice? Amy's new book shows us that that kind of evidence, the snippets from Tsuneno's letters that she includes, can be revealing in important ways. But at the same time, such evidence cannot be the whole story. My mother would have loved Amy's book. She dutifully read An Imperial Concubine's Tale, but when I asked her what she'd thought of it, she told me, I wanted to know more about her, what she was like. And that's precisely what Amy does so brilliantly in her book about Tsuneno. She takes readers to snowbound Rinsenji, to the tenements of Edo, and shows us what it was like. And this is perhaps my favorite example. So Tsuneno has been abandoned in a Minagawa-cho tenement by the guy she traveled to Edo with. She has one gold coin, all that was left of the clothes she'd pawned before she left Echigo. She has become a stranger in the Shogun city. What must that have been like? Amy writes, during those weeks in the tenement, Tsuneno was anonymous for the first time in her life. She looked around at the women her age and saw no one she recognized. Back in Echigo, an arch of an eyebrow or the curve of a hairline was all she needed to place a girl precisely within a family, in a constellation of villages and relatives, in a galaxy of people who had known one another's names for generations. The people she encountered were her grandfather's cousins, neighbors, her sisters-in-law, or her husband's families. They were her childhood friends, girls who knew which pickles were her mother's specialty, might have recognized one of her lined robes if she left it behind at someone's house. They might have been able to distinguish her brothers by their voices and known which one was her favorite. Some of the older women could probably state with authority that she was prettier or uglier than her grandmother had been when she was young. Amy cannot and does not say for certain that this is what it was like. That's somewhere in the archives, a letter survives mentioning Tsuneno's mother's pickles or a note sent with a servant to return that lined robe. But Amy has imagined for us what it might have been like to find yourself anonymous for the first time in your life. How the constellation that you were part of determined in so many small but weighty ways who you were and what you got to do in your life. And thus, by implication, how once you had left that constellation, you could be someone else. Amy is able to show us Tsuneno at this turning point in her life for various reasons. First, because she has slogged through the Rinsenji archives. Second, because she has visited the snow country where Tsuneno was born and grew up, and so she can describe what it looks like. Third, because she has researched the cost of living in early 19th century Edo, what commoner women were wearing that year, and many other facts that we use to write history. But being able to write paragraphs like the one I quoted requires something more than reading and research. And that's, of course, historical imagination. We might also call it historical empathy, the ability to go beyond narrating events and analyzing their import, and to get to the point where you can see the world through someone else's eyes. To those who'd ask how far speculation can go before biography becomes fiction, I would say this, that biography is a figurative form. It stands closer to portraiture than history. That all biographies embody the vision, the prejudices, the literary and research skills, the stock of knowledge of the biographer, and they often reveal as much about the biographer as about the subject. And so my question for Amy is, did you actually see yourself as working in the genre of biography? And, and did you have any particular models in mind as you were constructing Tsuneno's story and fitting her into the wonderful larger picture that you also paint in your book? And if I may pose a question to Marcia as well while I'm here. The problem of women in early modern Japan uses an enormous variety of evidence, including biographical evidence, to explore. And here I'm going to quote from Marcia's conclusion. The challenges women encounter when trying to reconcile social norms with individual autonomy, obligations to others with desires of their own, limited public authority with myriad forms of private power. And you also distinguish very usefully, I think, between agency and praxis, and make fascinating comparisons with late imperial China and Choson Korea, and between the very different political world of the Tokugawa system and our own much more regulated lives that we live in the modern state. So in exploring these really big questions, is it possible for you to say what kind of evidence you found most useful, or perhaps what I mean is most revealing of the answers that you were looking for? And so that's those are my questions for the other panelists. Thank you, Christina.
Amy, would you like to go next, or shall we shift to Marcia?
Hi, thank you, Gaye, for that. And I think that really you should have read my audiobook. So if we have another edition, I'm going to tell the publisher, you're the reader. And it's so nice. Thanks also to Marcia for agreeing to be a panelist, to Christina for organizing, and to so many people for showing up tonight, so many of whom I know from various places. So I wanted to talk about one of the things that Gaye actually brought up, which is the role of kind of personal identification in historical imagination. So I wrote this book, Stranger in the Shogun City, about this protagonist, Tsuneno, who ran away from home after being divorced 3 times, went to Edo with a strange man, and then refused to go back to the snow country, even though her brother and her mother were continually entreating her to come home. And Tsuneno is an interesting protagonist because she is a rebel, that she did not do what was expected. And that's kind of what makes her fascinating. But she was not the figure, the woman in the book, who I had the most trouble with, because Tsuneno wrote a lot of letters in which she expressed her motivations. Now, sometimes there were questions about whether or not she was telling the truth. Sometimes I was a little bit suspicious of her version of events, but at least we had her writing on the page. The person that I was that I had the most difficulty with is a really minor figure in the book, actually, and that is Tsuneno's sister-in-law, Sano. So Tsuneno's older brother is the one who took over the temple. His name was Giyu. He had a horrendous first marriage, which I'm not going to spoil for you. It appears in the book. And then he remarried a year later to this woman whose name was Sano. I didn't even find her name in the archive until I'd been reading for 5 years. I was desperately trying to find it out. Finally, I found it buried in a letter. There is no documentation that appears in her hand, so no letters. We have her posthumous name, which is not very revealing. And we have these kind of offhanded references to the fact that she's around. And then we also have a birth record that tells us that she had 5 children in 10 years. And so I thought of Sano as this kind of dutiful wife who did the things that were expected. She stayed put, she raised a family, she was the temple wife. Nobody ever said anything bad about her. So she didn't have any rebellion that left traces in the archive. And yet there was just this kind of blank void there. So I didn't know how to deal with this person who was Tsunemo's foil, but also so kind of implacably silent. And so when I tried to imagine what Sano's life might have been like, I originally wrote this passage that said, during those years, she was the vital center of the household and everyone depended on her efforts. Maybe she stopped in the middle of arranging her daughter's hair and found herself staring at nothing, or watched her son run through the garden and fantasized about leaving. Occasionally, during her daily prayers to the Amida Buddha, different, harsher words might have echoed in her head. But she still managed to do what was expected. She was bound by duty and routine, by the presence of children who needed her, by a workable, durable marriage, and maybe also by love. Now, I had a book manuscript workshop in which I invited scholars to help me by reading over the manuscript and telling me, you know, what was wrong with it, what should have been changed. And this ended up being the most controversial passage because my readers asked me, well, what is your problem with this woman, Sano? They said that, you know, by the standards of her time, she lived an ideal life. She was the mistress of a wealthy temple. Her children survived infancy. And I argued back, kind of based on my own embodied experience as a woman and a mother, that having 5 children in 10 years in a pre-industrial society, even if you have the help of your mother-in-law or servants, is actually a grueling form of labor, and that personal contentment isn't the same as the attainment of a cultural ideal. They argued back, well, you can't possibly know how she felt about this. And I said, well, even if I can't know, why can't I speculate that she might have hated it? And so we went back and forth because I found it important to kind of leave open the possibility for discontent and rebellion. And they found it more important to stress that this was, by the standards of the time, an ideal life that somebody probably would have been contented with. And I argued from my position as a woman and from the body in which I write. And to me, it was kind of it was more of a historical problem to leave that silence there than to speculate to fill it. But I think it's an open question and how much you can, as a woman, relate to a woman who lived in the past in a vastly different context, just because you're embodied in a particular way. And so my question to Gaye and to Marcia is twofold. Part of it is, how much do you identify with the women that you're writing about? Does that identification cause problems for you conceptually? And then also, what do you do with women who are like Sano? There are a lot of them in Marcia's book. Women who she points out, they did things like they got educated and they wrote and they traveled, all of which might seem to kind of transgress some boundaries, but ultimately they were working in the service of their household. Gaye writes about a woman who was definitely a rebel. She participated possibly in an orgy and then got herself banished. But there are many other women on the periphery of that story who are far more conventional, or who at least don't leave traces. So what do we do with those women who, as Laurel Ulrich said, are the kind of well-behaved women who don't typically make history?
Thank you, Amy. On that note, Marcia, can we turn to you?
Sure, thank you. Thanks to Christina for inviting me to be part of this, to Amy for writing such a wonderful book, and Gaye for also writing so many wonderful books. The most recent that will come out, everyone should buy it and read it, the Ogimachi Machiko book, and also the Imperial Concubine's Tale. So my work, my first book scarcely dealt with women at all. In retrospect, I could have included writings by women, but I wasn't aware of them at the time. And I didn't consider myself enough of an authority to speak to gender issues. And at that time, the historical imagination I was thinking about primarily was the geographical or the spatial imagination as it manifested itself in Japanese visual and textual culture. But as I was researching that book, I came across writings by women. I distinctly remember discovering the edited version, one of the edited versions, the earlier one of Taro no Makuzu's Mukashi Banashi on the bookshelves, the stacks of the UC Berkeley East Asian Library. For those of you who know the Berkeley Library, this was the old library, the really small one. So it was a miracle that it was on the shelves at all, because nothing was on the shelves. Everything was farmed out to cold storage. It's not the big, nice library that it is now. So I found this and I read it, and after looking around a bit, I found more writings by women, which was surprising to me at the time, because I wasn't aware that these extensive prose writings by women existed. And they seemed to me to challenge a lot of the presumptions about a woman's place in society that in the early 90s, when I was reading this stuff, was still firmly, rooted in the historiography, much more so than they are now. So my second book started with the question, well, if the early modern period represented the sort of nadir of women's experience when women were desperately oppressed by Confucian patriarchal norms, then why are there so many texts, published texts, about women's education, about women's cultivation, and women's behavior, hundreds of them extant, thousands of titles. And what about the certainly not insignificant number of surviving texts written by women of a range of ages and classes, though of course skewed more to elites. And so those questions became this book that Gaye and Amy kindly referred to on the problem of women, both the problem that women constituted in early modern society and my attempt as a historian to figure out and analyze that problem. So I used, as Gaye mentioned, a lot of different sources, diaries and memoirs by women, instructional manuals about women, most of which were authored by men, and later a few were also authored by women. And I think both of those sources, the writings about women, normative behavior, sort of instructional manuals about normative behavior for women, and also the actual accounts of women's lives, both of those, to kind of address Gaye's question, have their challenges. I think the biggest challenge for anyone dealing with diary and memoir sources, and I'll focus on those because they're closer to what we're going to be talking about today. The biggest challenge for anyone dealing with those sources is understanding what's not said, right? And understanding what's implied but not stated. And this is doubly difficult because you've just spent all this energy trying to figure out what is on the page, like literally what does it mean? And then you have to think about what is not there. And when you work with these kinds of personal writings, you realize the obvious fact that they're not written for us. They're not written for modern people. And you have to imagine how the writer conceived of her audience, because of course, personal writings like diaries and memoirs were not meant to be completely or even remotely private. And you have to think about what the audience would have known or assumed. And that often changes how you understand what's stated on the page. Now, I don't pretend to be an expert at this. And in the book, I hewed very closely to the sources. I didn't extrapolate from them very much, I think, because I somehow didn't feel entitled to extrapolate. And this gets to Amy's point. I think I did not feel close enough. I think I identified with the sources to a certain degree, but I didn't feel close enough to those subjects. And so in many ways, reading Amy's work and reading Gaye's work, I feel a little bit envious of their closeness to their subjects, because I don't feel that in that book, I had that kind of tie to the subjects of my research that allowed me to imagine fully enough maybe what their worlds were like. I kind of kept them at an arm's distance. More recently, I've come closer to achieving a kind of comradeship with two young women whose life stories were the focus of an article that I wrote that came out not too long ago on filial piety and female vengeance in the 17th and 18th centuries. And these were the young sisters, daughters of a peasant family, who came to be known as Miyagi-no and Shinobu. And they were said to have successfully executed a vendetta to kill the samurai who murdered their father. And I first discovered them in a collection of accounts of exemplary women that was fairly widely circulated in the early 19th century. But they were also made famous in kabuki plays and woodblock prints and other media of the time. And I traveled out to their hometown of Shiroishi in Miyagi Prefecture, just south of Sendai, one of those little towns where you get off the train and you look around and you go, is there anyone in this town younger than 60? There's just nobody there left there. And I found that they're kind of local heroes of a sort. They're memorialized all over town. There's a new IMAX movie about their exploits playing at the local history museum. And so all this was very interesting, but the problem was they never existed. They were entirely made up. And so the article focuses on the changing uses over time of this incidence of sort of fake news about vengeful but filial daughters. So I felt an allegiance with those people, but unfortunately they weren't real, which is kind of a bummer for me. My current, the work that I'm doing now looks at a different sort of family problem, which is how to keep families and lineages intact over time, especially in the early modern period when you have static population growth, relatively low fertility, and decreasing family size, but you also have a patriarchal and patrilineal family system that requires there always be a single male household head in any given situation. And so the solution is adoption. You have to be able to do it frequently, freely, and you have to be able to adopt adolescents and adults. Women are key to this family management process because even though the titular or public head of the family is male, and all permanent heirs are male, women play these key roles as mothers, daughters, wives, sisters, adoptees, adopters, and they were intimately involved in the strategizing of family continuity. So this particular project traces the development of adoption and family formation from legal and social and cultural perspectives from 1700 to 1925. And it shows how these family survival strategies developed in the early modern period evolve as Japan's legal and political systems underwent massive changes in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And the issue for narrative here, for me and sources, are the revelation to me are the modern sources. Because first of all, how many there are for an early modernist to wade into the modern period. There are sensationalist newspaper articles, there's serialized fiction, some of it very melodramatic, some of it by women. There's just all kinds of stuff. And these sources show, I think, how family problems are made public. Women's problems too are made public in ways quite different than they were in the early modern period. So I'm trying to figure out how to narrate and interpret these sources in a period I'm much less familiar with. So it's been really a delight and instructive to read how Amy has recreated the life of Tsuneno and how Gaye has dealt with these, well, in one case, Ogimachi Machiko's sort of massive diary and memoir, and then also piecing together the life of Nakako. And if I have questions, I guess I'll build on Amy's reference to Laura Ulrich about the well-behaved women, because as most of the women that I talk about in my book are actually fairly well-behaved. They play within the box, but Tsuneno doesn't, and neither does Nakako. And Tsuneno's unruliness led to the generation of these documents by and about her, all these letters and lists that told a different story, and eventually Tsuneno's own story. Similarly, the sources we have about Nakanoi Nakako exist in great part because she was embroiled in a sex scandal at court. And so I wonder about this, Ulrich's notion about unruly women or poorly behaved women making history. In the line from Ulrich comes from an article she wrote in the 70s about funeral sermons for Puritan men. right? And she writes in the book of essays that she wrote later on under the title of Well-Behaved Women Seldom Make History, where she's trying to figure out why people are so into this line that she wrote. And she says, this is a quote, "Nobody has proposed printing t-shirts with any of the other one-liners in my article on funeral sermons." And then she says, it's hard to imagine, people donning buttons, I'm paraphrasing here, donning buttons that read, quote, "The real drama is in the humdrum," or, quote, "They never asked me to be remembered on earth," or "They never asked to be remembered on earth, and they haven't been." So, nobody puts those things on slogans, but I think one of the wonderful things about both Amy's book and Gaye's books, and maybe I ask you to respond to this, is the way in which you take these exceptional people who have done sort of scandalous things, but put those scandalous acts and lives in the context of, given them the context that lets us understand it as part of a life, right? As part of a life that was, in some respects, humdrum. In other parts of it, everybody's life is. So could you speak to that, like a little bit about relating the scandalous, outrageous aspects to a sort of more normative life as it's lived, and how you dealt with that?
Maybe we can start with that question, and I'll just point out that we've had quite a number of questions related to historical imagination and the limits of that and the possibilities, essentially. So what are some of the challenges? Do you have advice for others as they're trying to think about use of historical imagination and writing about history? So if you can fold that in as you're thinking about that, then I'll interject later with further questions.
So I can start by building on Marcia's question, which is a really excellent one, because one of the things that people often ask me about Tsuneno is to what extent she was not an ordinary person, or to what extent she was a representative person. And they often ask me that about her marriages, because she did end up marrying 5 times in the end. She went through 4 divorces. And that I can say, well, there are women who actually did divorce multiple times, and 4 times is a lot, but it's not completely beyond the pale. And then I would say, so I ended up kind of having this idea of her as at the kind of outer edge of ordinary, because she didn't do anything so bad that she was arrested. She didn't do anything so bad that she was actually permanently cut off by her family. They kept trying to kind of cut her off, but then inviting her back in. So to me, she was a useful person for exploring where that boundary was between behavior that was normal but eccentric and behavior that was completely beyond forgiveness. And so that's where I landed with her specifically, but I also felt like it was important to keep talking about Giyu's wife, Sano, or her sister, Kiyomi, who was also obnoxious in her way, to think about, what is the range of possibilities for women. And so that was really, so Marcia's able to do that in her book because she has a bunch of different women that she's constantly talking about who come from different places at different times, different classes. And I had this one protagonist, but I felt like in order to situate her in her place and time, I could have done a lot of exposition saying, this many, marriages ended in divorce, or, the average woman, blah, blah, blah. But I found it more useful and more narratively engaging to kind of concentrate on some of these foils for her to kind of set up the range of possibilities for what a woman's life could be like. There is a problem with over-identification, right? Because if you over-identify and imagine that you are somehow in communication with a person who is, long dead from a different culture, speaks a different language from 200 years ago, you are doing kind of you are not being fair to that person's own subjectivity, right? And so you have this, you can at worst engage in a kind of sense of a kind of ventriloquism in which you force that person to articulate your own feelings and ideas. And, you know, when you are an American and a white woman who is writing about Japan, that can seem like a form of cultural imperialism, that you are, you know, bringing these 19th century Japanese women into your world and forcing them to speak your language and to convey your ideas. So it's very important to keep that boundary intact, and to say, you know, to clearly mark what is speculation and what is the subject's own words, and to not kind of put words in the subject's mouth. But I do think of, you know, embodiment and experience as a kind of language that, you know, in order to understand what Tsuneno is writing in her letters, you do have to learn Japanese, and you have to learn how to read the handwriting, and you have to be able to decipher what the letter says. To understand an experience like Sano's, we can't know because there is no language to convey it. But I think that embodiment, if that's all we have, can be a kind of way into understanding a person's experience. And so, you know, I don't fluently speak Tsuneno's language, and I don't fully understand her world. And I don't speak Sano's language of embodiment because my pregnancies were not her pregnancies. My childbirth experiences were not hers. But to say that 200 years later in a different context, I can't understand that at all, so that it's beyond the realm of speculation, means that nobody can speculate about her, and that she's left mute. And that to me is not acceptable, because most women don't leave records. So I think that in fact, it is more responsible to speculate within bounds than to say, to kind of throw up our hands and say, well, we can't possibly know, simply because I've encountered so many senior scholars and men over the years whose excuse for not talking about women is we can't possibly know, and that is that. And that is never that. And so I would rather take the example of someone like Saidiya Hartman, whose books have been really inspirational to me, and push as far as we can responsibly, rather than relinquishing that responsibility.
Wonderful.
Gaye, would
So
you
if
like
I
to-
might just respond very briefly to Amy's question about embodiment and identification with the subjects that we write about, which you've also spoken about yourself now. Certainly, I think with hindsight, I think one of the reasons why I didn't do any further work on Yosuno Akiko was because I couldn't get the children. So as a childless woman, I couldn't understand, I couldn't empathize with her experience of having 13 children in 20 years over the course of 11 pregnancies. She had 2 sets of twins. Anyway, and it's, in fact, I think it's something that many modern scholars are uncomfortable with, because nobody talks about it. And even in manga versions of, or perhaps especially in manga versions of Akiko's life and film versions, she's always shown with 4 or 5, but never with 11. So people are deeply, it seems to me at least, that they're uncomfortable with this. And it can't have been, how should we put it, accidental. Someone like Hiratsuka Raicho, for example, is roughly contemporary with Akiko, managed only to have 2. So, you know, what was going on there? I can't speculate on that, but one could do some research and find out, I imagine. You know, whereas someone like Nakako's, for example, again, I don't think I was conscious of this at the time, but I, you know, to the best of our knowledge, is a childless person, and I found it much easier, despite the distance from our lives here and now, to empathize, I suppose, with her life. So.
Marcia, would you like to respond?
I would like to kind of both respond and turn this to a related question. It was one of the ones that I had thought would be intriguing to discuss. This is a really interesting idea about sort of historical understanding as an extension of a personal connection or that one has with one's subjects. I think, I don't know if many of you, and certainly many of the people that I see in the chat, my colleagues, who should be up here instead of me, have worked with the historian Shiba Keiko in Tokyo, and she has done extensive work on women writers, and has never been an academic. She's always been an independent scholar, a very, very interesting person. And she, and so she's both excluded herself and, I think it's fair to say, been excluded by the academic women's history establishment because she's not an academic. And she says, she'll tell you, I just want to spend time with my women friends in the Edo period. That to her is what research is about. So spending, time with my women friends. And I think that's an attitude that she's gotten a lot of flack for from scholars who are more concerned with the social construction of gender and the theoretical approaches and, or the social history reconstruction based on data of women's lives. So so that's something that I always think about when I'm working on women's sources. But my question is is slightly different, but it's the same aspect of taking one's own experiences in the world and trying to formulate a historical question without imposing one's own biases on it. And this has to do with violence against women. And this is something I know Amy has written about. Tsunono herself was raped or assaulted in some way, we're fairly sure, by the aptly named Chikan. And also Gyu's wife, right? The first wife. I'm sorry, this is not a spoiler for people who haven't read the book, but is raped probably by the brother, the younger brother, right, Girin, so she was raped by the younger brother of her husband. And then she's expelled from the family along with their child and from the historical record. And Amy treats Tsunono's rape as something that she doesn't explicitly discuss, but it's something that she had to accept if she didn't want to be sent back to the village or stuck out alone on the road, right? It was something that was beyond her control, like the arranged marriages that she had been subject to and that she was running away from so as not to be subjected to yet another one, right? So she had to put up with it and move forward, I think is how Amy puts it. And Nakako was not, to my knowledge, rape per se, but one could consider how the whole institution of palace women and concubinage, I think, is to many present day observers inherently exploitative of women, though there are many ways in which historians would want to contextualize that particular form of exploitation. So my question is, how do we deal with issues like sexual violence against women or institutionalized sexual servitude of women in the context of pre or early modern societies in general, or in this case, Japan, because they so often operated, in contexts that are so utterly different from our own. And if either of you wants to take a crack at that.
Yeah, it's a hard one, isn't it? Yes, that there you are serving in the palace, and your name goes on the roster. It's your turn tonight. Or there you are, Machiko, living in Kyoto, and your mother arranges for you to become the concubine to a powerful man, and so you go up to Edo at age 16. There you are, and it's. I think we have to imagine. Yes, what do we imagine that what the alternatives might have been, I suppose, or perhaps that in a society where, at least among the elite, arranged marriage was universal, that it was an experience that was going to happen to everyone that you knew, and therefore it was normal, whatever we might have thought about it, whatever we might think about it now, Yes, that going to bed with someone you met that day because you were married and saw him for the first time is something that happened to my host mothers that I knew in Gifu in the 1970s. They, all of them, met their husbands on their wedding day. And so it was, so completely normal, well into our own time that yes, whatever sympathy one may feel it doesn't strike me as unusual, I suppose. Yeah, that's my rambling answer to your question.
Yeah, thank you. And it's interesting that you pointed that out, that particular passage about Tsuneno and her being sexually assaulted on the road, or what we would define as sexual assault, which she does not put that term to it. She talks about it in terms of marriage. And when I really started thinking about, what she meant by marriage, a person who has experienced 3 arranged marriages, by that point, the first of which was when she was 12 and was sent off to a distant province to marry somebody that she had never met, who was presumably much older than she was. Marriage doesn't have that kind of comforting, romantic, familiar sense to someone like Tsuneno that it would to us. So that is one way in which my experience could not inform, what it was that she was talking about marriage. And that's why context and deep reading and thinking about, what is normal, as Gaye just said, is really actually quite important. So we can't, assume some kind of unmediated connection. But I also wanted to highlight, once I thought about what Tsuneno meant by marriage and what were her experiences of marriage, I deliberately put that statement in there. I talked about the kind of acceptable violence at the heart of every arranged marriage, because I think it's useful to think about, well, what is the boundary between an arranged marriage of a 12-year-old and a rape? And I think that's, sounds like a very kind of, 1970s Andrea Dworkin-ish thing to say. But I think because, as historians, we are used to this being normal, and we just talk about these marriages and their marriages, and we just kind of take that for granted, that sometimes it isn't unfamiliar enough to us for us to kind of step back and say, wait a minute, what was going on here was actually a form of violence toward women. And so in that story about her being raped on the road by this man, Chikan, I wanted to bring that kind of sense of violence back into our somewhat idealized, I think, image of what these arranged marriages were like.
Can I bring this back to a question that's come up quite frequently among a number of people posing this, and that is this problem of identifying or feeling a kind of form of relationship with that embodied person you're thinking about, and the very category of woman or women and how we should be thinking about that, particularly in terms of the need to not just destabilize that, but think more broadly in terms of non-binary identities and in terms of thinking about some of the issues that Raj Pandey and others have raised. And so to what degree do we need to think about that issue of identifying with the person as you're thinking about historical imagination? And I would go a little further and say, what violence are we doing by actually pushing that forward too far? Do you have to relate to motherhood? Do you have to relate? I know that's often a draw for researchers, but can you each talk a little bit more about whether that's necessary or not? One of the questions was, well, then, can you relate to male narratives? I think we often have to, of course. And so could you address that a bit more broadly in terms of an issue that I think we have to unpack a bit further?
Yeah, I thought about this a lot. I don't necessarily think that it's a problem, because I'm not saying that, there is a category of woman that is stable. That means that you have a vagina and a uterus and you give birth, and I can relate to that because I too am a woman in that kind of categorical way. That is obviously not true, right? There's been a range of people throughout history who have been put into the category of women against their will, or have identified voluntarily as women who did not fit any of those kind of rigid biological categories. But I think that what I'm saying is something a little bit different, which is that, you know, I think that there are some experiences of being a man that I might have to stretch my imagination to write about because I cannot imagine, for example, being a coal miner. I have never had to participate in that kind of rigorous labor. And if I were to be able to write about a coal miner, I might have to kind of think about, if I were to write about a coal miner in the imaginative way that I would want to, I might want to really go into a coal mine and carry a shovel and really think about what the experience of coal mining was like. But what I object to is the idea that we all accept that coal mining is grueling labor because we can imagine carrying a shovel and being underground for 15 hours a day, even if we can't imagine it perfectly. But if I say, well, actually giving birth to 5 children in 10 years is a grueling form of labor, that immediately gets questioned because coal mining is seen as a kind of brutal form of labor that is oppressive, and being a mother is seen as something that is exalted by love and social approbation. And so I think actually that by deconstructing this idea that motherhood is always voluntary, that it isn't coerced, that it can be grueling and awful, that is a way of kind of deconstructing an idealized and totalizing version of womanhood that we no longer accept. So I don't think about destabilizing, I can't say who is a woman, who is not a woman. I'm not sure that that's the productive avenue of inquiry. But what I am saying is that through this kind of careful thinking about embodiment, we can arrive at ideas that will kind of help us think about gender and gender roles in a less kind of totalizing or dimorphic type of way.
Marcia or Gaye, would you like to take on any part of that question?
No, I certainly don't think I can improve on what Amy's just said now, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
I'll just say that, I mean, I certainly would never advocate a kind of an essentialist position that says only that childbearing women can write about childbearing women, or that, coal mining men can write about coal mining men, and that, fully acknowledging that those categories of womanhood and manhood are entirely, not stable. I think the issue for me in working on the early modern period and working specifically on women in the early modern period is that it's not so much that a lot of work has been done on the fluidity of gender norms in the early modern period, right? And performative gender roles. I mean, lots of really, really important and groundbreaking scholarship on that. That strikes me as something a little bit different than looking at the category of woman, which itself was very much idealized, as Amy said, and structured in the early modern period and articulated in these many, many instructional manuals as meaning something and as having certain parameters and boundaries and behaviors that attach to it. So that we, I think, can talk about notions of womanhood that were articulated as such in that period, right? Which is not to say that everyone therefore lived according to those norms in some natural or organic way, right? There was plenty of crossing boundaries of flexibility in the actual living of a gendered life. But I think the fact remains that those norms for womanhood were pretty clearly articulated and pretty widely known. So that's all I'll say for that.
I want to say one more thing, because probably the most direct place where I engage with that question in my book is with the kabuki actor, Hanshiro, who was an onnagata. He played women's roles. He did not identify as a woman, but he was somebody who was often depicted as a woman and who made himself up as a woman in order to go on the kabuki stage. And at the end of chapter 6, I flip back and forth between him and Tsuneno because they happen to be living in the same neighborhood at the time, and really talk about how, you know, his identity as the onnagata Hanshiro was constructed. And her own identity as a woman was also in her own way constructed, right? So she blackens her teeth, she wears her hair a certain way, she dresses in the clothes that are sent from home, and that is what makes her who she is, right? Which is a well-bred woman from Rinsenji in Niigata. And that there isn't such a difference between kind of putting on the clothes of a woman when you were a man in order to express yourself as a woman, and putting on the clothes of a woman when you were a woman in order to express yourself as a woman.
Or even as a person. I mean, I think you do that so well when you quote her letters or letters about her saying she's naked, you know. And I mean, obviously she wasn't literally naked, but she might have well been, because she was not representing herself in an appropriate manner, in a way appropriate to her station. So yeah, that's a great point.
Another question is related to historical fiction and to what extent each of you feel comfortable, and particularly Amy, in terms of writing this, taking a page out of that form of narrative in terms of writing as historical fiction. And where would you draw the boundaries there in terms of how much extrapolation you feel okay about doing or not, and perhaps why? And there's an additional question related to the book, in that you chose to format it with footnote references at the end, but not actually indicating that through the text. So it's can be looked at separately or read without that. And I mean, that's a very different format from what we're used to with academic writing, obviously. And so this seems to be clearly something that you're doing to open it up to a broader audience, but I think that's in some ways related, and so the questioner asks about that as well.
That's a really excellent question. And one of the problems that I've had is that people who are not academics read this book and think it's a novel. And that is because of using the techniques of fiction in the writing, but also because of the formatting. It's amazing the extent to which the format of a book, the physical format of a book, conditions the way in which we read it, right? Which of course, Marcia pointed out in her work on Edo period books. So I think, you know, there is a boundary between historical fiction and fiction. And the boundary is that I cannot engage in any speculation without marking it as such. And I cannot claim to know things that I don't know. However, that itself is a little fuzzy, right? So if I say, because when I think about it, right, like, how do historians know the things that we know? If you really think about this too much, we don't know anything. So somebody like Makiko or anybody could write in their diary, you know, today, 12/2, I, went to visit so-and-so and brought her a fish. And we don't, interrogate that, like, well, was it really a fish? Was it really that day? Was she lying? Did she actually know this person? So in writing history, we're always making some cognitive leaps. And our epistemology, it can be pretty shaky, because we tend to say, we can make these claims if there is no reason to believe otherwise, that we don't actually believe the person is deceiving us. Then we can just say, on 11/12, Makiko went to this woman's house and delivered a fish, without saying, well, according to her diary, she did this, but we don't know whether she did it or not. Or another good example is the safflowers in Dewa province that I describe as being gold. Why do I think they're gold? Well, I Google image searched fields of safflowers in Dewa province in Yamagata, and they look gold. And now maybe safflowers have changed, I also looked at them in the scroll. They kind of look gold to me. So I felt like I could make that claim. But then someone else said, well, what if they were all picked, to be processed and they never actually retained a full state of goldness? So there are all sorts of things, right, that you can interrogate forever, and there will never be enough footnotes to support all of historians' claims. So every act of writing history is an act of imagination, and every single time we write, we all write from within bodies, and we all make assumptions. And so I think that in some ways, writing a work of history that is, meticulously cited and scaffolded in a scholarly way, that also dares to make claims that are kind of marked as speculation, is pointing out some of the kind of epistemological limitations of any writing history, because we're all doing it all the time, whether we highlight it or not.
I just want to mention that historians have done this in so many different and interesting ways. Many of you are familiar with Susan Mann's book, The Talented Women of the Zhang Family, where she inserts the historian says, right, where her own speculations are always headed by the little mark, the historian says, which she borrows from the Chinese classics. So yeah, there is this line that I think we're very conscious of not crossing, however our footnotes appear or don't appear. But I wanted to ask specifically, Gaye, because in your book, in the Imperial Concubine's Tale, you look at all these different sources, because there are no writings by Nakako herself, and one of them is a historical novel. And I think you remark in particular that the historical novel to you was more revealing of Nakako than actual, what we would call, verifiable historical sources, that there was something about the way in which the novelist had recreated the situation that was more revealing. And so how do we as historians use historical fiction as a historical source, knowing, of course, that it's not, that it's fabricated in great part?
Yes, I think I could check, but I think what I meant by more revealing was more revealing of how she was seen by others, not in any sense revealing of what her real self was, which we can't get access to for the most part, but as a piece which showed us what people thought about the incident at the time. So there's Gyuichi's account of the incident, there's the poems by father and brother, and there's this Kanazoshi, this story about the whole event, and they all see the sequence of events in different ways. And of course there's the Oyudono no Ue no Nikki, the palace women's logbook, which also gives an account of it as well. So I certainly didn't mean that it was revealing of anything we might call the real Nakako, only that it was revealing of the way that people thought about the incident.
I also think, I teach a class about historical fiction, in which we read a lot of what we would consider now to be Japanese fiction about the past. So, for example, Tale of the Heike, right? So many elements of it are fictionalized. And, one of the reasons that historical fiction exists is to fill in gaps in the historical record, because people had a desire for a history in which they could see a broader range of people represented, and including people who were closer to their own experience. So, somebody who was a guide for deer, or somebody who was a woman who was, gyo, or, an entertainer, or somebody who was a poor fisherman, right? And these people do not come up in documents, but they come up again and again in forms of even pre-modern historical narration. And I think that you can see this today when we see there's so much historical fiction with female protagonists, and especially ordinary women. And that's because I think there is a hunger to identify, and that the kind of standards of professional history writing, which rightly demand that we have documentary evidence for the claims that we make, force us to leave out so many different kinds of people and protagonists that even people right now are really anxious to hear about. And so I think that there is a place for the kind of academically trained historian in some way to engage in a kind of broader history writing like somebody like Hartman has done, simply because if you don't do it, you kind of abandon the past to fiction, some of which is very responsibly written and some of which is utterly fantastical. And the kind of realities of the vast majority of the population's experiences get totally written out, and you end up with a shelf full of biographies of George Washington.
We've had a number of questions asking, where do you see history writing going? If you can surmise on that a bit in terms of, you've spoken a lot about the potential for historical imagination in terms of thinking through history. People have mentioned the potential of microhistory as well. And the way that women's history may be more broadly integrated into the teaching and writing and reading of history now. Could each of you take a little bit of time to think about future directions you see in your own work or more broadly in the field?
I am often kind of dogmatic on the point that people often say, well, the work of the original generation of historians of women was just about inclusion, and it was add women and stir. And then, as we developed a more robustly articulated theory of gender, we have been able to move on from that. So they're, taking the Jones Scott article, gender is a useful category of historical analysis, and saying, well, there are better ways to write about gender and think about, the way that idea structured the past than to just kind of add women for the sake of inclusion. I have never believed that, and I don't think that work is done. And I don't think that what the original generation of women's historians did was just adding women and stirring. I hate that phrase. Nobody mentioned it here. I just like to bring up every once in a while how much I hate it, because as everybody knows, if you add an ingredient and stir, you get a different dish. It's kind of a silly thing to say. And I also think, and will say very clearly, that if you read the social history of early modern Japan, women are not included. You can read entire books where there are barely any women mentioned. And that is true in the Japanese historiography, and it's true in the English language historiography as well. So I do not think that the task of representing women, and I mean women in a very broad sense, or even people who did not identify, if there's a category of people who were not men, who were not adult men, who were heads of households, who are the kind of typical people who are represented, I do not think that work is close to done. What I do think is a problem is that people dismiss it as being kind of auxiliary. And I think that we still have that problem in this field, and we are going to continue to have it. Now, one thing I would like to say as well is because Tomi asked me a question about, well, what would you do if you were writing about men? And I said, well, certain kinds of men I could not write about without having that experience. And Jordan Sand said, well, women were coal miners too. That's true. I can't write about women coal miners in the 1930s because I have no idea what that experience was like until I kind of try and more fully imagine that kind of experience. But what I do think is that we can start to write histories that put men and women on equal terms. And so in my next book, whatever that is, and I want to be clear that I'm not able to work on it right now because of the circumstances of the pandemic and all the caregiving that I'm doing instead of researching and writing, I think that we can write about both men and women and people who are not typically represented in a way that more fully imagines their experience of the world in a subjective way. And I think, I really do think that historians should become, especially social historians, should become more comfortable with a certain degree of speculation and also risk-taking in order to bring a fuller sense of we can't be so afraid to be wrong. Everybody's wrong all the time. And if you don't get anything wrong, the future generations can't correct you. So I would just argue for kind of more boldness and more risk-taking in general.
That's it. I won't cover that same territory because I think Amy covered it really well. One thing I will say about format, the formatting of books, and what is in terms of like future directions. And this is slightly different tack, but you know, in the way the academy is structured limits how we can write, right? Assistant professors can't write, or it's going to be very hard for somebody to get tenure on the basis of a book that is partly fiction or historical imagination or something like this. I mean, it for better or worse. And I'm not saying that I agree with the structure, but the structure is how it is. If you're lucky enough to have a job and you want to keep that job, there are certain ways that you have to write. And when you get to a certain stage in your career, if you're lucky enough to get beyond those probationary stages, then you have a little bit more latitude. And yet I think by that time we're so conditioned to write in a certain way that it's hard to get out. And so I very much admire what Amy's done with her book, because the voice is so different and original than many and then academic books. And I agree with Gaye. My mother, my late mother, would have loved your book. She dutifully read my book, but I think it was a bit of heavy sledding. I would be really interested to hear what folks on the call have to say. I mean, in the seminar more largely have to say about different options for types of academic writing and how we might start to think about rethink our mission of reaching a wider audience as academics in general, but certainly as scholars of Japan. I mean, there's lots of interest, and I think we all have different understandings of what it means to cross those boundaries into more accessible types of writing.
Professor Rowley, I think you're muted at the moment, but
okay, very briefly then. Certainly, I don't think I could have written the Nakako book if I had still been working in the UK, where they have a very rigid system of research excellence, rankings and so on of university, and the only thing, and certainly I couldn't have translated Matsukage Nikki either, since translations are not regarded as a form of original scholarship in that ridiculous system that they have there. And I suppose one of my purposes, though certainly not the only one, and not the major one by any means, of translating Machiko's Matsukage Nikki, is because there is almost nothing by women translated from the Kinsei period. There's Oan Monogatari, which has actually been translated 3 times. There's Tadano Makuzu's work, which has been translated by Bettina Gramlich-Oka. And there's one story by Arakira Rei, some wonderful translations of Emma Saiko's Chinese poetry, her kanshi. But it's very hard to put anything together that remotely resembles what's available for Saikaku Akinari and various Basho, Chikamatsu, all of these people. And so that's, I'm trying to do my bit to add women, and when we stir, something very different is going to appear, I hope.